The most dangerous thing you can do to a brilliant mind is convince it that it doesn't belong in a room. Zuri Bennett had spent years being looked through, invisible in plain sight, pouring water for men who never once considered that the woman holding the pitcher might be the smartest person at the table. But one afternoon, a billionaire decided to make her the punchline of a joke in front of his entire board. He slid his billion-dollar financial charts toward her with a smirk and asked the waitress what she thought. The laughter that followed was loud and easy. What came next was neither. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The lunch crowd at Meridian was the kind that came with expensive watches and louder opinions. It was a restaurant where the tablecloths cost more to press than most people's weekly groceries, and the clientele knew it. Every table held some version of power. Tech founders, real estate titans, men in tailored suits who never seemed to blink when the bill arrived. Ethan Caldwell fit right in. He sat at the corner booth, his preferred table, always reserved, with his CFO Greg Holloway on his left and two board members, Douglas Finn and Walter Pruitt, seated across from him. The conversation had been going for nearly 40 minutes, but the tension had been there from the start, invisible and tight, like a wire pulled just short of snapping. The numbers weren't good, not catastrophically bad. Ethan wasn't the kind of man who let things get catastrophic. But the quarterly projections on the tablet in front of him showed something he didn't like. A slow, quiet bleed in liquidity. Not enough to alarm anyone at first glance. Just enough to make a man like Ethan sit slightly straighter than usual. The Hargrove partnership still moves us forward, Greg was saying, his voice smooth and assured, the way it always was. Greg had a gift for sounding confident even when the ground was shifting. The overseas expansion builds long-term equity. The short-term liquidity tightening is manageable. Manageable, Douglas Finn repeated, not entirely convinced. He was older, cautious by nature, the kind of board member who'd seen enough cycles to distrust the word manageable. Define manageable in this rate environment. Ethan didn't answer right away. He was looking at the tablet, at a particular spike in the debt refinancing column. It was a small thing, easy to overlook, but he'd been in this business long enough to know that small things in finance were never actually small. He reached for his glass of sparkling water and leaned back, projecting the ease he was paid to project. We have flexibility, he said finally. The model holds. That was when the waitress approached. She moved through the restaurant the way people do when they've learned to be invisible by necessity, quietly, efficiently, without announcement. She was in her late 20s, black, with natural hair pulled neatly back and eyes that took in a room the way a camera does. All at once, without appearing to. She carried a pitcher of water and reached their table with a brief, professional smile. Can I refresh anyone's water? No one really looked at her. That was typical. In rooms like this, servers existed in the peripheral vision of men like these. Present but not seen, useful but unremarkable. She began pouring, moving around the table with practiced ease. But as she reached Ethan's side and leaned slightly to fill his glass, her eyes traveled, just for a moment, just a breath longer than necessary, to the open tablet on the table. The financial charts, the columns, the annotated projection lines. It was barely a pause, a fraction of a second. Ethan caught it. He was a man who noticed things. It was, in his estimation, his greatest professional asset. He noticed the way she looked at those numbers. Not with confusion, not with polite indifference, with recognition. He smiled, the smile of a man who thinks he's about to say something clever. Well, he said, loud enough for the table to hear, gesturing toward the charts with a lazy wave of his hand. What do you think? Should we short energy and go all in on emerging biotech? The men chuckled. Walter Pruitt actually laughed out loud, a short, dismissive sound. Greg smiled the way he always did when Ethan made a joke, easy and practiced. It was the kind of question that wasn't a question at all. It was a performance of superiority, a small, casual cruelty dressed up as humor. The waitress stopped pouring. She didn't look flustered. She didn't smile apologetically or pretend she hadn't heard. She straightened slightly, her eyes steady, and said in a calm, even voice, I wouldn't move liquidity into biotech if your debt exposure is tied to floating rate instruments. The laughter stopped, not gradually, instantly, like someone had cut the sound. Douglas Finn slowly lowered his glass back to the table. Walter Pruitt's smile didn't disappear so much as it dissolved into something uncertain. Greg's expression went very still in a way that was different from surprise. It was the stillness of a man recalculating. Ethan stared at her. How do you know about our debt exposure? He asked. His voice was quiet. Careful now. The playfulness was completely gone. She didn't flinch. She set the pitcher down gently and reached, without asking permission, to indicate a section of the printed chart that sat beside the tablet. Her finger hovered just above the page, not touching it. "Because this spike right here suggests you're refinancing something short-term," she said. "And if rates move again, which they likely will, you'll be squeezed. The biotech sector has high volatility tied to regulatory cycles. If your floating rate exposure triggers margin pressure at the same time you're trying to reposition, you'll be managing two fires instead of one." Dead silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the soft clink of silverware, the low murmur of other conversations, continued around them, indifferent, while their table sat in its own stunned pocket of quiet. It was Greg who broke it first. He forced a light laugh, the kind designed to recalibrate a room back toward normalcy. "She probably Googles buzzwords on her break," he said, with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. But Ethan wasn't listening to Greg. He was watching her. She had already picked up the water pitcher and was preparing to step back from the table, composed and unbothered, as though she hadn't just walked a hand grenade into the middle of their afternoon. "Where did you study?" Ethan asked. She met his eyes for a moment. "Just a moment." "I didn't," she said. And then she walked away. Ethan watched her cross the restaurant floor, back to the service station, back to her section, back to invisibility. Something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement, not irritation. Something more like the feeling he got when a dataset turned out to contain more information than he'd expected. Greg leaned toward him almost immediately, his voice low. "Don't entertain this, Ethan. We have real analysts." "She waited your table." Ethan said nothing. He reached forward and picked up the tablet. He looked again at the spike she'd pointed to. His jaw was tight. She was right. He'd known it already, somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part of him that ran numbers even when he was supposed to be relaxing. He'd known it and had been letting Greg's confident projections soothe the instinct away. But hearing it spoken out loud, plainly, by a woman holding a water pitcher while Greg's laughter was still echoing, that changed something. The lunch wound down with polite formality. Decisions were deferred. Greg kept the conversation going, smooth as ever, moving them toward the exit with his usual blend of charm and deflection. Walter and Douglas left reassured, or at least performing reassurance, which in Ethan's world often amounted to the same thing. But that evening, alone in his home office with the city laid out below his floor-to-ceiling windows, Ethan pulled up the full financial model on his monitor. Not the presentation version, the raw one. He went straight to the debt refinancing columns. He traced the floating rate exposure across the subsidiaries. He mapped the potential squeeze scenarios against biotech volatility indices. Every path led to the same conclusion. She was right. If rates moved the wrong way, and the current signals suggested they might, Caldwell Capital would face a liquidity crunch they weren't positioned to absorb while also rebalancing the portfolio toward biotech. It wasn't a fatal scenario, but it was a painful one. The kind of pain that made investors nervous. The kind that made headlines. He sat back in his chair for a long time, looking at the numbers. Then he whispered to himself, not really to anyone, just to the quiet room and the city lights and the chart on the screen. Who is she? The question didn't leave him. Ethan Caldwell was not a man who asked questions he couldn't answer. His professional life was built on the architecture of certainty, controlled environments, verified data, vetted people. The idea that a waitress at Meridian had read his company's financial exposure in a matter of seconds, from a passing glance at a printed chart, and had articulated it more clearly than any of his analysts had in the past month, that didn't sit cleanly in any category he had for people. So the next evening, he went back. He requested her section. The hostess, a young woman who clearly recognized him as a regular, didn't ask questions. She led him to a table along the quieter side of the restaurant, and within a few minutes, the same waitress appeared. Her name tag read, Zuri. She looked at him with a kind of expression that suggested she'd already known he was coming, or at least hadn't been surprised. She took out her notepad. "What can I get you?" "Just water for now," he said. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and slid a folded napkin across the table toward her. On it, he'd written 3 words, "Explain yesterday." Off the clock. She looked at the napkin. She looked at him. Then she tucked her notepad under her arm. "I don't give advice for free," she said. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "I'm not asking for charity. Name your rate." "It's not about the rate." Her voice was polite, but there was no give in it. "You came here because something I said bothered you. That means the advice was worth something. Worth something doesn't mean free." Ethan considered her for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket again and set a folded piece of paper on the table. Not money, but a printed scenario. One of his analysts had run it that afternoon. All right, he said. A scenario then. No strings. If oil collapses 15% next quarter, what happens to a diversified hedge fund with current exposure in 3 energy subsidiaries and a floating rate refinancing schedule? She didn't look at the paper. She looked at him. You'll trigger margin calls in 2 of your subsidiaries, she said. The third might hold, depending on its hedge ratio, but the liquidity pressure from the first 2 will force asset liquidation before you're ready. If your refinancing window is within 60 days of that oil movement, you won't have enough flexibility to respond without taking a public loss. Ethan went very still. He had never mentioned subsidiaries. Not yesterday, not today. Not in any public filing that connected to his name in a way an outsider could trace from a brief glance at a lunch table. I never said anything about subsidiaries, he said. No, she agreed calmly. But the structure of the exposure you showed yesterday implied it. A portfolio with that kind of floating rate concentration doesn't sit in a single entity. That's a structural signature. You have at least 3, probably 4 subholdings carrying divided risk. She said it the way a professor might explain something to a student who'd asked a good question. Not showing off, just answering. Ethan leaned back very slowly. He was quiet for a long moment. I want to offer you a consulting position, he said. No, thank you. You haven't heard the terms. I don't need to. She tucked the scenario paperback toward him. I don't work for companies that don't know where their money is going. That line landed differently than she probably intended it to. Or maybe exactly as she intended. It hit something beneath the surface, something Ethan couldn't immediately name. Not offense, not irritation, more like the sensation of a truth that had been sitting in the corner of his vision for months, and someone had just pointed a flashlight directly at it. He didn't respond right away. She moved off to check on another table, and Ethan sat with his water and the quiet hum of the restaurant and that sentence turning over in his mind. I don't work for companies that don't know where their money is going. He didn't see the man in the far corner booth. Greg Holloway had arrived at Meridian 20 minutes earlier. He'd taken a table in the restaurant's less prominent section. Not his usual spot, nothing that would announce itself. And he'd ordered a drink he wasn't planning to finish. He was watching. He'd seen Ethan request her section. He'd seen the napkin exchange. He couldn't hear the conversation from where he sat, but he didn't need to hear the words to read the shape of what was happening. His jaw was set. His drink sat untouched. He watched Zuri walk back toward Ethan's table with the quiet attention of a man who was doing math in his head. Back at the table, Ethan had moved on from the sting of her decline. He was practical above all else. A consulting position isn't the only option, he said when she returned. You could be an independent advisor. Project-based. Your terms. I'll think about it, she said. And he could tell she meant that she wouldn't. He studied her for a moment. There was something about her composure that he couldn't quite locate. Most people in her position, serving tables for a man of his visible wealth, having just turned down an offer that represented a significant financial step up, would show something. Eagerness, anxiety, pride, resentment. She showed none of those things. She was just calm, steady, as though the conversation was happening at a speed she'd already prepared for. He asked one more question before he left. Where do you actually come from professionally? You didn't just pick this up from reading. She was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, thoughtful. My father taught me to read financial structures when I was 14, she said. He believed that understanding where money moved was the same as understanding where power moved. He said if you could follow the money through a system, you could see what the system actually valued, not what it said it valued. Ethan said nothing. She moved away again. He left a tip that was 3 times the bill and sat in his car for 10 minutes before driving anywhere. By the next morning, he hired a private research firm. The directive was simple. Find everything publicly available on a woman named Zuri who worked as a waitress at Meridian, probably living in or near Manhattan, likely with a finance background. Within 36 hours, they sent him a file. He read it twice. MBA, Columbia University. Graduated with distinction. Thesis title, Derivative Risk Exposure and a Mispricing of Systemic Leverage in Mid-Tier Hedge Funds. Internship at Harrington and Cole Investment Bank, one of the more respected mid-size houses on the street. Strong internal reviews. A trajectory that had looked, by all accounts, like the beginning of a serious career. And then, nothing. The career path stopped abruptly. Around the same time, a man named Robert Bennett was arrested and charged with embezzlement at his firm. Robert Bennett, her father. The case had received modest coverage. A mid-level financial professional accused of diverting client funds over a period of 3 years. He maintained his innocence. The conviction had come anyway. Ethan read the file again. The pieces were visible if you looked at them in order. A promising career derailed not by failure, but by association. A daughter who clearly had the credentials and the talent, and had, for reasons this file didn't explain, ended up carrying plates in a restaurant instead of building portfolios. He closed the file and looked out his office window. Why is she serving tables? The question sat with him like an equation without a variable. He could see the shape of the answer. He couldn't quite prove it yet. The journalist arrived at Caldwell Capital's lobby without an appointment, which was either boldness or miscalculation, and with Lucas Reed, it was probably the former. He was a lean man in his late 30s with the kind of face that suggested he'd heard every polished non-answer there was, and had stopped finding them interesting. He asked to speak with someone regarding irregularities in financial reporting connected to Caldwell Capital's overseas accounts. The receptionist called Greg immediately. Greg came downstairs in person, which was itself a statement. Not the kind that welcomed the journalist, but the kind that established who had control of the building he was standing in. He was cordial, professional, and utterly immovable. "We don't have anything to comment on regarding unspecified irregularities," Greg said, with a smile that managed to be warm and dismissive at the same time. "If your publication has something specific, have your editor reach out to our legal team. We're always happy to clarify misinformation." Lucas Reed looked at him for a moment before accepting his card and leaving. Greg watched him go through the lobby glass, his smile still in place, his eyes completely flat. 2 days later, Ethan agreed to meet Zuri again. This time not at Meridian, but at a coffee shop 3 blocks away, on her day off. She came wearing plain clothes, no name tag, and looked, if anything, more at ease outside the uniform. He told her about the file. He told her what he'd found, not as an accusation, more as a kind of transparency, an acknowledgement that he'd investigated her and owed her the honesty of saying so. She listened without surprise. "I assumed you would," she said. "Then you know I know your background." "Yes. So, why the tables?" "You could have rebuilt after your father's case. There are firms," she said quietly, "that would have seen my father's name attached to mine and made the same assumption every search would. That's not rebuilding. That's trying to convince people that their first impression was wrong. I got tired of trying to do that." Ethan was quiet. She looked at her coffee. "But that's not why you wanted to meet." "No," he admitted. "You ran an internal audit after the lunch." He looked at her. "How did you know that?" "Because if you didn't, you're not as smart as I thought you were. And I don't think that's the case." A pause. "Did you find anything?" "A small discrepancy," he said, "in one of the subsidiary transfers. Small enough to be an accounting error. But you don't think it's an error?" "No," he said. "I don't." She nodded slowly. She set her cup down. "Your books are clean on the surface," she said. "Too clean. Real financial operations produce friction, small inconsistencies, rounding differences, timing mismatches between accounts. Clean books with no natural friction usually mean someone has spent time making them look that way." Ethan said nothing, but something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like the relief of having a thought confirmed by someone who had arrived at it independently. "You need to look deeper," she said. "And you need to do it without whoever manages your internal accounts knowing that you're looking." She met his eyes directly. "Do you know who you can trust in your finance division?" Ethan thought about Greg, about the 5 years they'd built together, the way Greg knew the company structure almost as well as Ethan did, the way Greg had always been the one to smooth the difficult transitions, the one who stayed late, the one who handled the parts of the business Ethan preferred not to manage himself. He thought about the small discrepancy, the tiny, intentional-looking discrepancy. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm starting to wonder." That night, Ethan sat alone in his home office again. The city outside was the same. The screens were the same, but the shape of what he was looking at had changed. He opened a deep access audit interface that bypassed the standard internal reporting channels. He entered the oldest transaction records he had, 5 years of data, raw and unfiltered. He started from the beginning. He wasn't looking for anything large. He was looking for a pattern. An hour later, he found it. Small, consistent, a series of micro discrepancies in subsidiary transfers, each one individually explainable, collectively forming something that had no innocent explanation. It was too small to be careless. It was too consistent to be accidental. Someone had been inside his books for a long time. Someone who knew exactly how much they could take without crossing the line that would trigger an automated alert. Someone who understood his systems the way only a few people could. He stared at the data until his eyes burned. Then he closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, the numbers living in his head, and thought about a woman who had read his company's vulnerabilities from a passing glance at a lunch table. and wondered what else she already knew. The discrepancies were small enough that most people would have missed them entirely. That was the point. Ethan had been in finance long enough to know the difference between sloppy bookkeeping and deliberate concealment. Sloppy bookkeeping had a randomness to it. Errors that clustered in some quarters and disappeared in others. Numbers that were off by different amounts in different directions. The natural chaos of human imprecision. What he was looking at now had none of that. It was too consistent, too measured. Each discrepancy sat just below the threshold that would have triggered an automated compliance flag, and each one occurred at a slightly different interval, as though whoever was responsible had taken care to vary the timing so that no pattern would be obvious to a casual review. But Ethan wasn't doing a casual review. He was doing the kind that started at the very beginning and refused to stop until it found something or found nothing, and he hadn't found nothing. He pulled transaction histories going back 5 years. 5 years of transfers, allocations, subsidiary movements, inter-account flows. He printed nothing. He saved nothing to any share drive. He worked alone on a standalone device, and he told no one. The picture that emerged over 3 days of late-night sessions was not dramatic. There were no large sums missing. No single transaction that would make a prosecutor lean forward in their chair. Instead, there were hundreds of small ones, each individually defensible, collectively forming a structure that only made sense if you believed someone had been slowly, carefully, patiently redirecting capital for years. It was, Ethan thought, the work of someone who understood his systems. Someone who knew exactly where the automated alerts sat. Someone who'd had years to learn the architecture of Caldwell Capital from the inside. He called Zuri. She met him at the coffee shop again, early morning, before the city's midday noise built up. He showed her the transaction map he'd built, printed on paper, nothing digital that could be intercepted, and watched her study it with the same focused quiet she brought to everything. She didn't rush. She traced the flows with her fingertip, moving from entity to entity, following the money the way her father had taught her, not looking at what was there, but at where it was going and why. After several minutes, she looked up. The discrepancies spike in specific windows, she said. I noticed. Quarterly cycles mostly. Not just quarterly. She pointed to 3 clusters on the map. These 3 happen within 48 hours of major internal decisions being finalized, before they're announced externally. Someone with advanced knowledge of those decisions used the window to move capital before the information became public. Ethan looked at the clusters again. His expression was very controlled. That's insider timing, he said. That's coordinated insider timing, she said quietly. This isn't someone taking advantage of a coincidence. This is someone who knew the decisions before they were made. That's not a junior-level access. That's executive. The word sat between them. Ethan didn't say Greg's name. Neither did she. But the shape of what they were both thinking was the same, and they both knew it. Greg had been pushing the overseas expansion deal for 3 weeks. On the surface, it made reasonable sense. A strategic partnership with a European private equity group, structured to expand Caldwell Capital's presence in emerging markets. The projections were attractive. Greg's team had built a presentation that made the numbers sing. Growth potential, market positioning, diversification against domestic volatility. But when Zuri looked at the structure of the deal, not the projections, but the underlying mechanics, she saw something that didn't fit. The capital commitment required up front is disproportionate, she told Ethan. You'd be moving a significant chunk of your liquid reserves into a partnership structure that locks them for 18 months. Given your current floating rate exposure, that's not diversification. That's concentration. Greg says the risk is manageable. She looked at him steadily. Does he say that a lot? That things are manageable? Ethan didn't answer right away. You're being pushed towards something, she said. This deal doesn't benefit Caldwell Capital. It benefits whoever benefits from Caldwell Capital being illiquid for 18 months. Ethan stared at the deal structure in front of him. He'd had reservations, quiet ones, the kind he'd been letting Greg talk him out of for weeks. Hearing Zuri name the mechanism didn't create the suspicion. It confirmed it. He decided to test her. Not because he doubted her. He was past doubting her. But because he needed to know the limits of what she could see. He gave her a modified financial summary. A realistic-looking document with one key difference. He'd altered the liability figures for 2 of his subsidiaries. Not dramatically, just enough to change the picture slightly if you took it at face value. She read it for about 90 seconds. Then she set it down and looked at him. This isn't real, she said. These liability numbers are hidden. You've either buried them in a consolidated line item or moved them temporarily off balance sheet. The ratios don't work if these figures are the true liabilities. I adjusted them, he admitted, to see if you'd catch it. She nodded, unsurprised. And You caught it in under 2 minutes. The ratios gave it away immediately. You can hide a number, but you can't hide what a number does to everything around it. That's always where the truth lives, in the relationships between figures, not the figures themselves. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. I want you to look at the full picture, he said. Everything, not just what I show you. I'll give you access to the raw records. If I do that, she said, you need to understand what we might find. I know what we might find, and you're prepared for it. He didn't answer immediately. He thought about Greg, about the years, about the deal structures Greg had championed and the client relationships Greg had managed, and the number of times Ethan had leaned on Greg's judgment in moments of genuine uncertainty. About what it meant if all of that had been something other than loyalty. No, he said honestly, but I need to know anyway. Lucas Reed found her on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd done his research. He knew about the lunch, about Ethan's return visits, about the fact that a waitress named Zuri had somehow become part of Ethan Caldwell's inner circle, or something close to it. He was a journalist who followed threads the way other people follow directions, persistently, without necessarily knowing where they ended. He caught her outside the restaurant as her shift ended, and he was straightforward about who he was and what he wanted. I think your employer's being set up, he said. I've been looking at irregularities in Caldwell Capital's reporting structure for about 4 months. What I'm seeing doesn't look like executive malfeasance. It looks like a frame. Zuri studied him. She had a good instinct for people who were telling the truth versus people who wanted her to think they were, and Lucas Reed had the slightly tired, slightly single-minded look of someone genuinely following a story rather than building one. I don't have anything to tell you, she said. I'm not asking you to tell me anything. I'm telling you what I found. She considered that distinction. Then tell me. He outlined it briefly. The pattern of irregularities he'd identified from public filings and secondary sources, the way they tracked against a timeline that suggested external coordination. He said the word orchestrated twice, carefully, like someone who'd earned the right to use it but still handled it with care. Zuri listened without confirming or denying anything. Why come to me? She asked. Because you're clearly not a bystander, he said. And because I think you've seen something in those books that I can't see from the outside. She was quiet for a moment. If I had anything to tell you, I need to know what you plan to do with it. Publish, he said simply, but not until the full picture is clear. I'm not looking to create a story. I'm looking to tell one that's already happening. She left without making any commitments, but she thought about what he'd said for the rest of the evening, and she didn't dismiss it. The pattern Zuri had identified was becoming harder to ignore the more she looked at it. Every cluster of micro-discrepancies, every window of misaligned capital movement, corresponded to a period following a specific type of internal transaction, authorizations that required CFO-level sign-off. Not all transfers, not random allocations, specifically the ones that passed through the office of the chief financial officer before being finalized. She built a timeline. She matched it against the transaction map Ethan had given her. The correlation wasn't perfect. Nothing was ever perfect in this kind of work, but it was consistent enough to be meaningful. She didn't want to tell Ethan yet, not until she was certain. In her experience, certainty in financial forensics didn't come from the first pattern you found. It came from finding the same pattern through multiple independent paths and arriving at the same destination each time. She worked through 2 more evenings on her own, using the access Ethan had provided, building the case from different angles. Each time, the trail led back to the same authorization windows. Each time, the name at the top of those windows was Greg Holloway. She told Ethan on a Thursday morning, over coffee, in the same careful, methodical way she approached everything. She didn't begin with Greg's name. She began with the structure. Someone is bleeding you slowly so you don't notice, she said. Not taking large amounts. Taking manageable ones, repeatedly, over years. By the time the cumulative total becomes significant, it's been distributed across so many transactions that tracing it requires the kind of audit that doesn't happen unless someone is specifically looking. And someone is specifically looking, Ethan said. Yes. Now, she paused. The authorization signatures on the relevant transfers are consistent. The pattern doesn't emerge from the general population of transactions. It's confined to a specific approval channel. Ethan was very still. Greg's channel. The CFO authorization window, yes. He said nothing for a long time. Outside the coffee shop window, the city moved in its usual indifferent morning rhythm. Taxis, delivery people, the ordinary commerce of a Tuesday. Inside, the quiet between them was dense with something that wasn't surprise exactly, but was adjacent to it. More like the feeling of a fear that had been living in your peripheral vision for a long time, finally stepping directly in front of you. He's been with me for 9 years, Ethan said. I know. We built this company together. Not just professionally. We built it. I know that too. He exhaled slowly. All right. A pause. How do we confirm it beyond what you've found? You question him directly. Carefully. Not accusation. Observation. See how he responds to a question he shouldn't be able to answer cleanly. That afternoon, Ethan found an opportunity. He brought up one of the flagged transfer periods in passing, framed it as a routine review question, something about reconciling the quarterly numbers from 3 years ago. He watched Greg's face. Greg laughed. He offered an explanation that was technically plausible and delivered with the ease of someone who had spent years being the most confident person in any conversation. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate, but his jaw tightened, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second before the professional mask resettled. Ethan had spent 9 years watching Greg's face. He knew what relaxed Greg looked like. He knew what performing relaxed Greg looked like. This was the second one. He returned to his office and sat quietly for several minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called Zuri. It's him, he said. He found the offshore account 3 days later. He'd been working backward through the transfer chain, following the money through the layers of entities it passed through before disappearing into what the records described as a standard liquidity management allocation. Standard allocations didn't get routed through 3 separate jurisdictions. Standard allocations didn't terminate in an account registered to a holding company whose incorporation documents listed a Cayman Islands address and no operational footprint. The authorization signature on the original transfer that had seeded the account was 6 years old. The name on the authorization was Greg Holloway. Ethan sat with that document on his screen for a long time. He thought about everything Greg had said over the years about risk management, about long-term positioning, about trust. He thought about the way Greg had laughed that first day at the restaurant. She probably Googles buzzwords on her break, and the way he'd watched Ethan's eyes follow Zuri across the room and had known, even then, that something had shifted. He called Zuri again. It was late. She answered on the second ring. I found it, he said. An offshore account. Shell company. The seed authorization has his name on it. It goes back 6 years. She was quiet for a moment. How much has moved through it? I haven't traced the full amount yet. But it's significant. Another pause. Don't confront him. Don't indicate that you know. Whatever you do in the next 48 hours, he cannot know that you've found this. Understood. And Ethan, she hesitated. We need to be careful about what we do next. Because if we move wrong, this gets buried and we lose the only advantage we have right now, which is that he doesn't know what we know. Ethan agreed. He closed the account file. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his home office, at the ordinary white surface above him that looked exactly as it always had, and thought about the fact that for 6 years he had been running a company that someone he trusted had been quietly dismantling from within. He was still sitting there when his phone lit up with a news alert. He read the headline. Then he read it again. Caldwell Capital under federal investigation for alleged financial fraud. Sources point to executive misconduct. He looked at the alert for a long time. His face was very calm in the way that faces become calm when the thing they've been dreading has finally arrived and there's nothing left to dread. Then he turned on the television. There was Greg, on camera, outside the building, suited, composed, his expression carrying precisely the right blend of concern and sadness. Speaking to a reporter. The quote at the bottom of the screen read, I warned leadership about aggressive accounting practices on multiple occasions. Greg looked directly at the camera with the face of a man who had been vindicated by tragedy, and Ethan watched him perform innocence with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing for years. The markets opened the next morning, and Caldwell Capital stock did what panicked markets do when a headline uses the words federal investigation and executive misconduct in the same sentence. It dropped, not gradually. Not the slow bleed of a company facing routine regulatory pressure. It dropped the way a stone drops when there's nothing beneath it. Fast, clean, and with a finality that made recovery sound theoretical. By midday, 14% was gone. By close, it was closer to 20. Institutional investors who had been with Caldwell Capital for years quietly began liquidating positions. The phones in the investor relations office rang without stopping, and the answers they got were not reassuring because the people giving those answers didn't have reassuring things to say. The board convened an emergency meeting. Ethan attended. He sat at the head of the table where he had always sat, in a room where he had made decisions that moved markets, and he listened to Douglas Finn and Walter Pruitt and 4 other board members speak in the careful, liability-aware language of people who needed to be seen doing the right thing regardless of whether they believed in it. The vote was not close. Effective immediately, pending the outcome of the investigation, Ethan Caldwell was removed as CEO of the company he had built. He didn't argue. He had known, walking into that room, that the vote was already decided. The board wasn't wrong to do what they did, from where they sat, with only the public information available to them. A CEO under federal investigation was a liability they couldn't carry. They were protecting the institution. He understood that. Understanding it didn't make it easier to sit through. He signed the documents. He shook hands with people who couldn't quite meet his eyes. He rode the elevator down from the 54th floor for what might be the last time, and he stood on the sidewalk in front of the building he'd founded and looked up at it for a moment before getting into his car. Zuri was in her apartment when the news broke. She'd been expecting something. She and Ethan had both sensed that Greg wouldn't wait much longer before making a move, that the awareness of Ethan's growing suspicion would eventually force Greg's hand. But seeing it unfold on television, watching the news anchors frame it in the language of fraud and misconduct, watching Greg's carefully prepared statement play on a loop. Her hands were shaking. She sat on the edge of her couch with the remote in her lap and her eyes on the screen, and the feeling that moved through her was one she recognized. It had a shape she'd learned a long time ago, when she was 21 years old and watching different news anchors frame her father in the same language. Financial misconduct, breach of trust. Sources indicate the same language, the same structure. A man with power and money using the machinery of reputation to destroy someone before they could defend themselves. This is exactly what they did to my father, she said aloud, to the empty apartment. Her phone rang. It was Ethan. Are you watching? He said. Yes. I've been removed as CEO. She closed her eyes briefly. I know. I just saw. He was quiet for a moment. They've built this very carefully. Whoever coordinated this, they didn't just find a moment of opportunity. They planned for this specific outcome. The media timing, the internal testimony, the way the evidence points, it's been structured. It has, she said. But structure leaves traces. They didn't do this cleanly, Ethan. They did it carefully, which is different. Careful can be unpacked. She heard him exhale. I'm in my penthouse. Can you come? She went. The view from Ethan's penthouse was extraordinary. The kind of view that cost a specific kind of money and announced it quietly every time you stood at the window. The city spread out below in its unceasing activity, indifferent to the collapse happening 54 floors up from the street. Ethan looked diminished in a way she hadn't seen before. Not broken. She didn't think this man broke easily, but stripped of the particular armor that authority provided. He was still sharp, still precise, but the layer of absolute certainty that powerful men carried like a second skin had cracked, and underneath it was something more human and more uncertain. He had printed everything. The transaction maps, the shell company documents, the offshore account records, the authorization signatures. They were spread across his dining table in organized stacks, and he was standing over them when she arrived. She sat down and looked at the data with fresh eyes. She had been tracking the discrepancies as evidence of embezzlement. That was the obvious read. But something Lucas Reed had said stayed with her. It doesn't look like executive malfeasance. It looks like a frame. And now, with the news coverage playing in the background and Greg's face cycling on the screen, she thought about what she was actually looking at. She looked at the timing. Not just the timing of the transfers, but the timing of everything. When the offshore account had been established, when the shell company had been incorporated, when the early micro-discrepancies had begun. She mapped it against the external timeline, against the market, against Greg's calendar, insofar as she could access it. And she saw it. The transfers didn't just spike before major internal decisions. They spiked before major media pushes. The offshore account had received significant deposits in the 48-hour windows immediately preceding each negative coverage event Caldwell Capital had experienced over the past 3 years. Minor articles, regulatory murmurs, analyst downgrades that had seemed at the time like ordinary market noise. They weren't ordinary market noise. Each one had been preceded by a deposit. Each deposit had been followed by a strategic leak to someone in the financial press or the regulatory structure. Someone had been purchasing ammunition and then using it at precisely calibrated moments. This wasn't just embezzlement. Ethan, she said, look at this. He came to stand behind her. She walked him through it. Not quickly, but precisely. The timing correlations, the deposit to publication windows, the way each media event corresponded to an outflow that would benefit someone positioned to short Caldwell Capital stock before the coverage dropped. Someone has been systematically shorting your company after pre-positioning the negative coverage, he said slowly. Someone or some entity, she said, and they've been doing it for years. This isn't about stealing from you, or not only about that. This is about collapsing your stock price at a specific moment so that someone can acquire controlling shares cheaply. Ethan straightened. A hostile takeover. A coordinated one, disguised as organic market decline and regulatory scrutiny. He was very quiet for a moment. Who has that kind of reach? To coordinate the media, the regulatory timing, the internal testimony. Someone with connections inside multiple institutions, she said. This is bigger than Greg. Lucas Reed had been doing his own threading. He called her the following afternoon. His voice had the particular quality it got when he'd found something slightly too controlled, like someone trying not to run. I've been tracing the private equity connections attached to the shell company your colleague found, he said. He'd been careful on the phone. No names, no specifics that could compromise anything if the call were somehow monitored. It's not a single entity. It's a network. At least 3 previous corporate collapses in the last decade follow an identical structural pattern. Different companies. Different CFO equivalent figures as the internal facilitators. Same beneficial ownership chain at the end of every trail. Zuri was sitting very still. How far back does the pattern go? Further than I expected. A pause. There's a name that keeps appearing in the beneficial ownership records. Not prominently. It's layered under holding structures. But it's consistent. An informal consortium, no formal registration anywhere, operates across jurisdictions. I've been calling it the Meridian Circle for about 3 months because that was the name that appeared in one set of incorporation documents before someone apparently realized they'd used a real name by accident. The name landed in Zuri's chest with a weight she hadn't anticipated. Send me what you have, she said. Everything. She went back to the data that night with a new frame Lucas had given her. The Meridian Circle, an entity that moved through legitimate corporate structures the way water moved through cracks, finding the weak points, widening them slowly, never announcing itself until the building was already compromised. And Greg hadn't built this. That was the thing. She could see it now in the way the operation was structured. Too sophisticated, too patient, too multi-layered for one CFO, however talented, to have engineered alone. Greg was a mechanism, a door opener. Someone placed inside Caldwell Capital years ago with a specific purpose of facilitating this exact outcome. She was still working through the documents when she found the shell company records Lucas had forwarded. She found the entity name first, Vantage Bridge Holdings LLC, incorporated in Delaware, operated through a Cayman Islands account, no declared beneficial ownership beyond a series of nested holding structures. She cross-referenced it against the records she'd been building, and the ground shifted. Vantage Bridge Holdings. She knew that name, not from Caldwell Capital, not from anything she'd encountered in the past weeks. From an older file, from a box her mother still kept in storage, from the case documents her father's defense attorney had collected before the conviction, before the evidence had disappeared, before the system had processed and closed a man's life with the casual efficiency of a machine that wasn't built to be careful with the people it processed. Vantage Bridge Holdings had appeared in the financial records her father had been investigating. Her father hadn't been embezzling. He'd been building a case against the same network. And when he'd gotten close enough to matter, they'd used the same mechanism on him. Internal documents arranged to tell a specific story, evidence that pointed conclusively at the man trying to expose them. They destroyed her father to protect themselves. And then, apparently, they kept operating. She sat at the table with the documents in front of her, and her hands very still, and her eyes not moving from the page. And she let the full weight of it settle. Her father had spent the last years of his career trying to unravel the same thread she was now holding. He'd come close enough that they decided he needed to be stopped. They'd stopped him the same way they were trying to stop Ethan now. Not with violence. Not with anything that left obvious marks, but with the machinery of institutional credibility turned against a single person who couldn't fight the whole system alone. She picked up her phone. Ethan answered on the first ring. "How soon can you get here?" she said. Her voice was level, but only by effort. 20 minutes. "What did you find?" She looked at the name on the document again. "The company that framed my father," she said. "It's the same one that's being used to frame you. He arrived in 18 minutes. She spread the documents on the table and walked him through it methodically. The shell company cross-reference, the beneficial ownership chain, the incorporation records, the financial trail that connected Vantage Bridge Holdings to both the Caldwell Capital operation and to the case that had destroyed her father's career and ultimately his life. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood with his hands flat on the table, looking at the documents, his jaw set. "Your father was investigating them," he said. "Yes." "And they shut him down?" "Yes. The same way they're trying to shut you down." Internal documentation arranged to tell a false story. A trusted figure within the organization providing testimony. Evidence that closed the case before it could be examined too carefully. Ethan looked up at her. Which means your father's conviction was a sentence carried out by the same people who are currently running this operation against you. She held his gaze. My father didn't embezzle anything. He found exactly what we're finding now, and they buried him for it. The silence in the room was dense and specific. Ethan's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Greg. He answered it on speaker. Neither of them moved. Ethan. Greg's voice was smooth, comfortable. The voice of a man who believed he was in complete control of the board he was playing on. I know this has been a difficult couple of days. I want you to know this isn't personal. Ethan said nothing. You were never the target, Greg continued. You were the doorway. The company, the assets, the market position. That's what this was always about. You were just the most efficient path to it. A pause. I genuinely respected you, Greg said, and it had the flat quality of something that might even have been true. For what it's worth. The line went dead. Ethan lowered the phone slowly. He turned towards Zuri. His voice was very quiet. What did your father find? She looked at him across the table, across the documents, across the years of distance between a man who'd built a billion-dollar company and a woman who'd been carrying water glasses in the same building where her father's name was still attached to a conviction that had never been true. The same thing we found, she said. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Greg's words hung in the air long after the call ended. You were never the target. You were the doorway. Ethan set his phone face down on the table. He didn't speak for a moment. Neither did Zuri. The document spread between them held everything they'd uncovered. The shell company trail, the transfer patterns, the offshore account, the name that had appeared in two separate cases separated by years and ruined lives. The quiet in the room had a particular texture to it. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people absorbing something too large to process quickly. It was Ethan who spoke first. Walk me through your father's case. Everything you remember. Zuri pulled her chair closer to the table. She didn't look at the documents when she spoke. She knew this part by memory, had known it the way you know the shape of scar. Not because you look at it constantly, but because it's always there. His name was Robert Bennett, she said. He was a financial analyst at a mid-size investment firm called Trelliswood Advisory. He'd been there for 11 years. He was good at his job, careful, methodical, the kind of analyst who noticed things other people walked past. She paused. He started noticing things he wasn't supposed to notice around the time I was finishing my undergraduate degree. What kind of things? Transfer patterns. Similar to what we've been tracking here. Small movements through multiple accounts, timed carefully, never large enough to trigger automated reviews. He didn't know what he was looking at initially. He thought it was internal mismanagement. But the more he traced it, the more it became clear that the movements were coordinated across multiple entities. Not just within Trelliswood. Across firms. Ethan was very still. He was mapping a network. She confirmed. He spent about 8 months building documentation. Quietly. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing because he didn't know yet who inside the firm was connected to what he was finding. She looked down at the table. He told my mother he thought he'd found something important. He said if anything happened to him, she should keep everything he'd collected. And then, 6 weeks later, he was arrested. Her voice remained level, but only by the kind of effort that had been practiced over years. The charges were embezzlement, diversion of client funds over a 3-year period. The documentation was detailed and specific, transaction records, internal memos, account statements, all pointing to him. Built to order, Ethan said quietly. Built to order. His defense attorneys couldn't break it because the documents were technically authentic, real records, real accounts, just arranged and annotated to tell a story that wasn't true. By the time the trial finished, his reputation was gone. His career was gone. She stopped. He died 4 years after the conviction. His health had been declining, and I think he just lost the will to fight it anymore. The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at the Vantage Bridge Holdings documents in front of him, and this entity was in his records, in the files his attorney collected during the discovery phase. It appeared as a connected holding structure in one of the transfer chains he'd been investigating. The attorney flagged it, but couldn't get more information before the trial concluded. She tapped the document. It's the same entity, same incorporation structure, same jurisdictional layering. They've been running the same operation for over a decade, Ethan said. At least. Lucas said the pattern goes back further than he initially expected. Ethan stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the city below, the same view he'd stood at the night he'd first whispered "Who is she?" to himself, though that felt like a different chapter of a different life now. He was quiet for a long time. Your father was trying to protect people he didn't even know yet, he said. Including me, apparently. Zuri didn't respond immediately. The thought had been sitting in her chest since she'd first made the connection, and hearing it said aloud by someone else gave it a weight that was almost physical. I need to call my mother, she said. Mrs. Adele Bennett answered on the third ring. She had the voice of a woman who had survived enough that very little surprised her anymore. Warm but grounded, with the kind of steadiness that came not from ease, but from having already faced the worst and found she was still standing. Zuri kept her voice calm. She explained, briefly and carefully, what she and Ethan had found. She said her father's name had appeared in documents connected to a financial network that was still operating. She said she needed to know if the materials he'd collected before his arrest were still intact. There was a long pause. I kept everything, her mother said. I know you kept things, Mama. I assumed it was personal items. Letters, photographs. Those too. But Marcus, your father told me specifically. He said there was a storage unit. He said keep the key and don't tell anyone and don't throw anything away, no matter how much time passes. Another pause. I thought he was being dramatic. I thought it was grief talking before the verdict even came. But I kept the key. Zuri closed her eyes briefly. Where is the unit? Her mother gave her the address. A storage facility in Queens, the kind that lined the outer boroughs in rows of orange-doored metal units. Anonymous and unmemorable. Zuri. Her mother's voice shifted slightly. Less even, more present. Is this dangerous? Zuri thought about the answer she wanted to give and the answer that was true, and found there were different answers. We're being careful, she said. They went the following morning. The facility was exactly what it looked like from the outside. Functional, unremarkable, the kind of place where people store the overflow of their lives. Unit 114 was in the second row, a mid-size unit with a combination padlock that Adele Bennett had given them the code for over the phone. When Zuri pulled the door open, the smell of old paper and sealed air came out first. The unit was more organized than she'd expected. Her father had been a methodical man. The boxes were labeled in his handwriting. Neat, precise, the same handwriting she remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists. Some boxes held exactly what she'd assumed. Personal items, photographs, the accumulated evidence of a family life. But stacked against the back wall, separate from everything else, were 4 bankers' boxes sealed with tape and labeled in a different way. Not names or dates, just numbers. Ethan crouched and opened the first one. Inside were printed transaction records. Hundreds of pages, organized in folders, each folder labeled with a company name and a date range. He lifted the top folder and scanned the first few pages. His expression shifted. These are detailed, he said quietly. Very detailed. Your father did serious work. The second box held handwritten notes, her father's analytical commentary running alongside the printed records, connecting transactions across entities, building the same kind of map Zuri had been constructing over the past weeks. The handwriting was the same neat script from the labels. Calm, precise. The work of a man who had understood what he was looking at and had taken the time to document it properly. The third box held something unexpected, encrypted drives. 4 of them, each labeled with a code that meant nothing on its surface. And beneath the drives, a single sheet of paper with handwritten instructions for decryption, written in a notation system that Zuri didn't immediately recognize. He encoded the instructions, Ethan said. He was careful, she said. The word came out softer than she intended. The fourth box held a map. Not a digital one. A physical, hand-drawn diagram of corporate entities, drawn on large sheets of graph paper and folded carefully. Boxes connected by lines, each box containing a company name, a jurisdiction, and a series of notations. The diagram was extensive. More extensive than anything she'd expected. Ethan stood up slowly, holding one of the graph paper sheets open with both hands. He studied it for a long moment, his eyes moving from entity to entity. I recognize some of these, he said. 3 of these holding structures are connected to entities I've seen in my own subsidiary chain. He looked at her. Your father mapped Caldwell Capital. It's here. He had it here years before any of this started. Zuri looked at the map in his hands. At her father's careful pencil lines connecting boxes across jurisdictions. At the name Caldwell Capital appearing in the network her father had identified as compromised, not as a perpetrator, but as a target. A doorway, as Greg had said, a company positioned within the network's reach, waiting to be used when the timing was right. Her father had seen it coming. He'd tried to document it, tried to build a case that could survive in a courtroom, and they had destroyed him before he could finish. She felt something give way in her chest. Not loudly, Not dramatically, just a quiet internal fracture, the way ice cracks before it breaks, a sound only she could hear. She sat down on a box near the door and put her hands in her lap and looked at her father's handwriting on the labels and let herself feel the full weight of it for the first time. Not the practical weight, the personal one. Her father had not been careless or corrupt or weak. He had been brave and careful and right, and it had not been enough, and he had died with his name still attached to a lie. Ethan said nothing. He set the map down and moved to lean against the wall, giving her the space of the silence without abandoning it. After a while, she straightened. She wiped her face once with the back of her hand. She looked at the boxes. "We take all of it," she said. Lucas cross-referenced her father's entity map against his own research that same evening. He called it 930, and his voice had the quality it got when the pieces had finally locked together into something irrefutable. "The network your father documented connects to at least 6 other corporate entities I've been tracking independently," he said. "There's a consistent beneficial ownership chain that surfaces in each one. Offshore structures in 3 separate jurisdictions, all ultimately feeding into the same controlling interest." He paused. "It operates informally, no official registration, no public documentation. But the structure is consistent enough across cases and years that it functions as a coordinated entity. I've been calling it the Meridian Circle." "We know the name," Zuri said. A brief pause. "Then you found more than I have." "My father found more than either of us," she said. "A decade ago." Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry about your father." She didn't respond to that. "Well, we need to dismantle this completely. Not just protect Ethan, expose the whole network. Evidence of coordinated activity across multiple instances," Lucas said without hesitation. "Not just proof that Greg stole from Caldwell Capital. Proof that the same methodology was applied across multiple targets, with the same beneficial ownership chain profiting each time. That's the difference between one CFO going to prison and an entire operation being dismantled. We have the cross-instance documentation," she said. "My father built it." Another pause, longer this time. "Then we have a case." The first thing Zuri did the following morning was freeze the liquidity channels. Not all of them. Not in a way that would be immediately visible to Greg or to anyone monitoring the account from outside. She worked with Ethan's remaining access credentials. He had been removed as CEO, but certain ownership-level access points hadn't yet been revoked in the technical infrastructure, and she identified the specific transfer pathways that had been used to move capital through the Vantage Bridge Holdings chain. She inserted quiet blockers. Small technical flags that would halt any new transfers through those channels without triggering the standard alert systems that Greg would be monitoring. If he tried to move more capital through those routes in the coming days, the transfers would simply fail to execute. He wouldn't know why. He would assume a technical issue. It bought them time. Not much time. Greg would eventually investigate the failures, but enough. Ethan watched her work. "You learned this from your father?" "Some of it. The rest I learned in my MBA and from a year at Harrington and Cole, where I spent most of my time in the systems architecture division rather than client-facing work because my supervisor thought it was a better fit." A brief, dry pause. He was right, as it turned out. "Why did you leave?" She didn't look up from the screen. "My father was arrested 3 months into that job. I took a leave of absence. By the time I came back, the association with his name had filtered through the industry the way these things do. Quietly. Nothing official. Just doors that were slightly less open than they'd been before." She paused. "I stopped trying to open them." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You were punished for something you didn't do." "Welcome to my father's experience," she said, not unkindly. The warning came that same evening. Zuri returned to her apartment at just past 8 o'clock. She'd locked the door when she left. She always locked the door, double-checked it the way her mother had taught her. She was certain of that. The door was slightly open. Not visibly, dramatically open. Just slightly ajar. The kind of thing that could be explained a dozen innocent ways and couldn't be explained a dozen innocent ways simultaneously. She stood in the hallway and looked at it for a moment before pushing it open carefully with her fingertips. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved, as far as she could tell. There was no note, no obvious sign of disturbance. It was a clean, professional message delivered through absence. "We know where you live, and we wanted you to know that we know." She called Ethan from the hallway without going inside. "Don't stay there tonight," he said immediately. "I'm not planning to." She kept her voice even. "But this means they know I'm involved. Greg may not know exactly what we've found, but someone in that network has identified me as a variable worth warning. That means we're closer than they're comfortable with." "Yes." She looked at the open door. "It also means the timeline just shortened." She stayed with her mother that night. She didn't tell Adele everything. She told her enough that her father's work was still relevant, that people were paying attention to it, that things were moving. Her mother listened in the way she always listened, completely, without interruption, her hands folded in her lap and her expression giving nothing away until she was ready. When Zuri finished, Adele was quiet for a long moment. He knew they might come back, she said finally. Yes. He documented everything because he knew they might come back. She unfolded her hands. He kept saying, "The work doesn't die just because I do." He said it like he needed to believe it. Zuri looked at her mother's face. "It didn't," she said. Later, after her mother had gone to bed, Zuri sat at the kitchen table with her father's last notebook. She'd brought it from the storage unit, small and worn, the cover soft from handling. She turned to the final pages, where his handwriting grew slightly less precise. The marks of a man who had known his time was running short. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before his conviction. She read it aloud to the quiet kitchen, to the ordinary sounds of a Brooklyn night coming through the window. "If anything happens to me, watch Caldwell Capital. They'll use it eventually. They always use the ones that are positioned exactly right, successful enough to be credible, trusting enough to be vulnerable. Whoever runs it when the time comes, they won't see it coming from inside. Someone outside will have to show them." She sat with that for a long time. Her father had written those words before she had ever walked into Meridian, before she had ever poured water at a corner table, before she had ever glanced at a financial chart and said the words that had changed everything. He had been trying to protect Ethan Caldwell years before they ever met. And somehow, in a way that made no logical sense and complete human sense, she had found her way to exactly the place where her father had needed someone to be. The plan came together over 4 days. Not quickly, carefully. Quickly was how you made mistakes that couldn't be corrected. Carefully was how you built something that held under pressure. Zuri had learned that from her father's notes, from his methodical documentation, from the way he had mapped an entire network by hand before anyone else had thought to look. She applied the same principle now. Ethan gave a controlled interview on the 3rd day after his removal. He'd resisted initially. The instinct of a man who'd spent his career controlling the narrative from a position of strength was to stay quiet when that strength was temporarily absent. But Zuri made the argument plainly. Silence reads as guilt in a situation like this. The story that's being told about you right now is the only story. If you don't offer a different one, even a partial one, the public image calcifies and it becomes much harder to crack later. What do I say? I can't reveal what we've found yet. You don't reveal it. You acknowledge imperfection without accepting culpability. You talk about oversight gaps. You hint, carefully, without specifics, that the picture is more complicated than reported. You plant a seed of doubt without giving away the garden. He thought about it. That's a fine line. Yes, don't cross it. He did it well. She hadn't doubted he would. Whatever his flaws, Ethan Caldwell was genuinely intelligent and genuinely composed, and sitting in front of a camera speaking in measured, thoughtful language about operational failures while hinting at deeper institutional complexity was, if anything, easier than the kind of crisis management she suspected he'd navigated before. The markets didn't recover, but they stabilized. The accelerating drop slowed to a tremble. A few analysts revised their projections from catastrophic to uncertain, which in financial journalism amounted to a cautious vote of confidence. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the institutional investors from full liquidation while the longer game played out. Zuri worked behind the scenes with the consistency of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment her entire professional life. She didn't ask for credit. She didn't want visibility, not yet, and possibly not ever, depending on how things resolved. What she wanted was to make sure the work was done correctly, because correctly was the only way it held. She rebuilt Ethan's legal defense strategy from the ground up. The attorneys he'd had in place were competent, defensive-minded lawyers whose instinct was to construct the smallest possible target surface. Deny, delay, negotiate. Standard approach for white-collar defense. Not wrong, but not suited to what Ethan was actually facing, which wasn't a straightforward fraud allegation, but a carefully constructed frame that needed to be dismantled rather than defended against. She drafted a strategic memo and sat with his lead attorney, a careful man named Warren Albright, for 3 hours one morning, walking him through the forensic analysis she'd built. Albright was skeptical at first. He had the particular caution of senior attorneys who'd seen clients arrive with elaborate alternative theories and then watch those theories collapse under cross-examination. He listened with his hands flat on the table and his expression professionally neutral. By the second hour, his hands had moved. He was leaning forward. By the third hour, He'd asked his associate to take notes. "This changes the filing strategy entirely," he said. "I know. If the forensic documentation holds, and this is detailed enough that I believe it does, we're not defending against a fraud allegation. We're building a counter case for corporate sabotage. With the Meridian Circle as the defendant," she said. Albright looked at her for a long moment. "You understand this becomes a much larger and more dangerous proceeding." "I understand. These aren't small actors." "No," she agreed. "They're not." He nodded slowly. "All right, let's build it properly." The financial trap took 2 days to design and 1 afternoon to set. The logic was clean. Greg still believed he had the upper hand, that Ethan was panicked and distracted, that the legal machinery was grinding in the right direction, that the stock collapse was proceeding on schedule. He had no reason to deviate from the established pattern, and the established pattern included periodic transfers through the shadow account channels. Zuri had unblocked one specific pathway, one of the smaller channels she'd flagged earlier, and reactivated it in a way that was indistinguishable from a routine technical restoration. If Greg's team was monitoring for the blockages she'd inserted, they would see the channel come back online and interpret it as confirmation that Ethan's IT infrastructure was running on reduced oversight. They made the channel look attractive, a dormant allocation that had a plausible operational explanation, with enough capital sitting in it to make a transfer worthwhile for someone who believed they were operating freely. Then they waited. They didn't have to wait long. 41 hours after the channel was reactivated, Greg authorized a transfer. It was a large one, significantly larger than the micro-discrepancies Ethan had traced in the early audit. The confidence of someone who believed the target was incapacitated and the opportunity window was wide. The transfer executed, and every step of it was logged in a way that bypassed Caldwell Capital's internal reporting systems entirely, routing instead to an external forensic server that Warren Albright's team had established for exactly this purpose. Zuri watched the confirmation come through on her laptop. She sat back and looked at it for a moment. "He took the bait," she said. Ethan, standing across the room, exhaled slowly. "Fully logged. Completely. Authorization signature, timestamp, destination account, the full chain. It's clean." He nodded. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired and resolved, which was a more honest response to the situation than triumph would have been. Lucas called the following morning with something that shifted the scope of everything. He'd been cross-referencing Meridian Circle's operational history against public corporate records for weeks, building a timeline of their activity across a decade. What he'd found was not 1 or 2 precedents for what had happened to Caldwell Capital. It was 3. 3 corporate collapses in the past 11 years that follow an identical structural pattern, he said. An internal CFO equivalent figure placed years in advance. Slow capital siphoning disguised as operational variation. A coordinated media and regulatory strike at a predetermined moment. Stock collapse followed by acquisition of controlling shares at depressed prices. A pause. In each case, the CFO equivalent figure was positioned within the target company 3 to 5 years before the operation activated. Greg Holloway joined Caldwell Capital 8 years ago. Ethan, who was listening on speaker, said nothing. In each of the 3 previous cases, Lucas continued, the original CEO was either convicted of financial misconduct or forced out under regulatory pressure. None of them were guilty of what they were accused of. One is still in prison. Another pause. The beneficial ownership at the end of each acquisition chain traces to the same set of offshore holding structures. The same network. Every time. Meridian Circle, Zuri said. Yes. And in each case, the network acquired the target company at roughly 30 to 40% of its pre-collapse valuation. They made billions doing this. Systematically. Over more than a decade. The room was very quiet. "I have enough to publish a preliminary story," Lucas said. "Not the full picture yet, but enough to establish the pattern publicly and put the network on notice that the story is coming." "Not yet," Zuri said. "I know. I'm not suggesting yet. I'm saying the material is there when we need it. We need one more thing first," she said. "We need Greg on record." The conversation between Ethan and Zuri that followed was the first one in weeks that wasn't primarily about strategy or evidence or legal positioning. They were sitting in the kitchen of Ethan's penthouse. Not the formal dining area where the documents usually lived, but the kitchen, which was smaller and more ordinary and felt less like a war room. Ethan had made coffee, which he did competently and without ceremony, and they were sitting across from each other with the evidence temporarily set aside. He said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "For what?" "For the first day." The joke. He looked at his coffee. I used you as a punchline in front of people I was trying to impress, because you were holding a water pitcher and I assumed that was the full measure of what you were. Zuri was quiet for a moment. You weren't unusual in that assumption. That doesn't make it less of one. No, she agreed. It doesn't. He looked up. After my father died, my mother used to say that arrogance is just fear with better clothes. I thought I understood what she meant. I didn't really until recently. Zuri thought about her own father, about a man who had never had the resources or the platform or the institutional credibility that Ethan had, who had found the same network with fewer tools and less protection and had paid the highest possible price for it. My father wasn't afraid, she said. He knew what he was up against, and he did the work anyway. I know, Ethan said. That's why I said I didn't understand arrogance until recently. Your father had more courage than anyone I've ever worked with. And I never knew him. She looked at him for a moment. At the man who had asked a cruel joke of a question 8 weeks ago and had, in the time since, been stripped of everything he'd built and found that what remained was something more honest than what had existed before. He would have respected what you're doing now, she said. That's not nothing. 2 of the board members came to Ethan privately on a Tuesday afternoon. Douglas Finn and a woman named Patricia Hartwell, who had been on the Caldwell Capital Board for 6 years and had the particular composure of someone who had outlasted several crises and had learned to read the difference between the kind that destroyed companies and the kind that revealed them. They came without announcement to Ethan's penthouse. They sat across from him in his living room, and Douglas spoke first. We never fully believed it, he said. The accusations. The framing of it didn't sit right from the beginning, and the speed of Greg's positioning after the media broke the story. He paused. It had the smell of preparation. It was preparation, Ethan said. Do you have evidence? We have substantial evidence. Forensic documentation, a log transaction, cross-case pattern analysis, and a journalist who's been building the supporting story independently for months. Patricia Hartwell leaned forward slightly. What do you need from us? When the time comes to move, and it's coming soon, I need the board to be ready to move quickly. Reinstatement pending disclosure. Support for a counterfiling. And the willingness to let a new structure come out of this that addresses how we got here. Douglas and Patricia exchanged a brief look. The kind of look that had already had its conversation elsewhere. We're with you, Patricia said. Greg felt it before he could identify it. That was how it worked with people who were good at reading rooms. The shift registered before the specific evidence did. Something in the texture of his communications with the Meridian contacts had become slightly more urgent in tone. Something in the responses was shorter than usual, less assured. He'd sent 3 requests for status updates on the acquisition timeline in the past week. 2 had gone unanswered for longer than was normal. He began to make more calls. His messages grew more frequent. The rhythm of someone who was used to being in control and was finding that the usual signals weren't coming back at the usual intervals. He didn't panic. He wasn't a man who panicked. But he moved differently, slightly faster, slightly less patient. The way a chess player moves when they've noticed their opponent is taking longer to respond and started to wonder why. He didn't know about the log transfer. He didn't know about the forensic server. He didn't know that a journalist had spent 4 months documenting 3 prior instances of the operation he'd spent 8 years executing. He didn't know that a woman he dismissed as a curiosity had spent the last several weeks dismantling the case against her employer while simultaneously building the case that would unravel everything Greg had constructed. He was, in other words, exactly where they needed him to be. Zuri decrypted the master file from her father's archive on a Thursday night. The encryption notation her father had left, the coded instructions on a sheet of paper beneath the drives, had taken 2 days to fully work out. Her father had been thorough. The system he'd used wasn't standard, and it had taken a combination of her own knowledge and some quiet consultation with a cybersecurity contact she trusted to fully execute the decryption. The file opened at 11:47 at night. She read it alone first. Then she called Ethan. He picked up immediately, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. The archive had a master document, she said. My father was further along than I knew. He didn't just map the entities, he collected names. What kind of names? She looked at the screen, at the list her father had compiled, at the names attached to the beneficial ownership chains, at the titles next to those names. Politicians, a senator, and 2 congressional representatives, 3 bank officials from 2 separate institutions, 5 corporate executives across industries, 2 regulatory officials who had sat on oversight committees, people whose positions gave the network its immunity, people whose presence in the structure explained why the previous 3 corporate collapses had been investigated briefly and inconclusively, and then quietly closed. The kind that explain why this has been operating for as long as it has, she said. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. How many? She looked at the list again. Counted. Enough, she said, that when this breaks, it doesn't break as a financial fraud story. It breaks as something much larger. She heard him exhale slowly on the other end of the line. Outside her mother's window, Brooklyn carried on in its ordinary nighttime way. Traffic, voices, the indifferent sounds of a city that didn't know yet that a list of names on a dead man's encrypted drive was about to change the shape of several powerful people's lives. Zuri looked at her father's work on the screen in front of her. She thought, I see you, Dad. I finally see all of it. And then she got back to work. The meeting was Ethan's idea, but the architecture of it was Zuri's. Greg received the invitation on a Friday morning, a private sit-down, Ethan's penthouse, describing the message as a conversation about stepping aside permanently and resolving this quietly. The language was carefully chosen. It spoke to the version of Greg that believed he had already won, the version that expected a defeated man asking for terms. Greg arrived confident. He came alone, no attorney, no intermediary, which told Ethan everything about how safe Greg believed himself to be. He wore the expression he always wore when he held the advantage. Calm, slightly warm, the face of a man performing reluctant generosity. They sat across from each other in the living room. Ethan poured water. Neither of them touched it. 3 blocks away, in a rented office space that Lucas had arranged, Zuri sat at a laptop connected to a live audio feed. Warren Albright was beside her, a legal pad open in front of him, pen moving steadily. Lucas sat at the far end of the table, headphones on, recorder running. Ethan began with the expected conversation, board dynamics, public perception, the possibility of a negotiated exit that avoided further media attention. He let Greg lead. He let Greg be comfortable. And Greg talked. He was careful at first, measured. But comfortable men in winning positions tend to expand into the space they're given, and Ethan kept giving him space, kept asking the kind of open questions that invited elaboration, kept his own expression neutral and slightly resigned. Greg began to fill the silences with more than he needed to say. He said that aggressive restructuring had been necessary to reposition the company's long-term value. He said that certain accounting approaches, while unconventional, had been sanctioned by the broader strategic vision. He said, and this was the moment Albright's pen stopped moving and then started again faster, that the transition of controlling interest to a more capable ownership structure was ultimately better for investors, even if the path there had been uncomfortable. The merged entity will be stronger, Greg said. You are always going to be better served as a division than a standalone. The market was always going to reach that conclusion eventually. We just accelerated the timeline. Who is we? Ethan asked. A brief pause. Not long enough to be obvious. Long enough to matter. The stakeholders who saw the larger picture, Greg said. It wasn't a confession in the clean, courtroom sense. It was better than that. It was a man explaining his actions in the language of someone who had never genuinely believed they were wrong. That quality of certainty was, in its own way, more damning than an admission. It showed the operation not as a desperate crime, but as a calculated, institutional act conducted by people who considered themselves architects rather than criminals. Albright looked at Zuri. She nodded once. Within the hour, the SEC notification had been filed. The supporting documentation, forensic transaction records, the log transfer, the cross-case pattern analysis, her father's archive materials, the master names list, went simultaneously to 3 separate regulatory bodies and to Lucas, who had his story ready and published it within 90 minutes of receiving the package. The story didn't run quietly. It ran everywhere. By evening, the financial markets had reacted with the violence they reserved for genuine, systemic revelations. Several executives named in a master list issued statements through attorneys. 2 announced immediate resignations from their respective positions. International regulators in 2 jurisdictions opened preliminary inquiries before the American news cycle had finished its first rotation. 3 days later, Greg Holloway was detained at JFK, attempting to board a flight to Zurich. The composure held until the agents produced the documentation. And it didn't hold anymore. The calm facade that had served him for 8 years cracked in a departure terminal in front of strangers. And what was underneath, it was simply a frightened man who had run out of road. Ethan watched the footage on the news from his penthouse. He felt nothing triumphant about it. Just a heaviness that was part relief and part grief for 9 years of misplaced trust. The kind of feeling that didn't have a clean name. The official vindication of Robert Bennett came 6 days after the initial publication. The prosecutor's office that had handled his case issued a formal statement acknowledging newly surfaced evidence that materially undermined the original conviction. The statement was careful and institutional in its language, the way these things always were. It did not say we were wrong or a man's life was destroyed by a lie. It said the evidence warranted review and that the conviction record would be amended. The news outlets that covered it were less careful. They ran photographs of Robert Bennett. They ran interviews with his former colleagues. They ran a segment that included footage of a much younger Zuri at her MBA graduation, her father standing beside her in his good suit, both of them squinting slightly in the sunlight. Zuri watched that segment alone in her mother's kitchen. Her mother came and sat beside her without saying anything and put her hand over Zuri's on the table, and they watched Robert Bennett's face on the screen together. At the press conference 2 days later, Ethan stood at the podium in front of cameras and journalists and the board members who had quietly supported him through the final stretch. He spoke about the investigation, about the network that had been exposed, about the systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed it to operate for as long as it had. Then he paused. None of this would have been uncovered without someone who saw what I couldn't see from inside my own company, he said. Someone who had every reason to walk away from this and chose not to. Someone everyone in this industry, including me, when we first met, underestimated completely. He looked toward the side of the room. Zuri Bennett. She stepped forward into the light for the first time. Not toward the microphone. She didn't take the podium. She simply stood where she could be seen, in a room full of cameras and journalists, and the weight of everything that had led to this specific moment. She looked out at the room and thought about her father's handwriting on the storage unit boxes, about a list of shell companies mapped by hand on graph paper, about a man who had done the work correctly and had not lived to see it matter. It mattered now. The offers came quickly. 3 firms reached out within the first week after the press conference. Executive roles, all of them, VP of Risk Analysis at one, Chief Strategy Officer at another, a partnership track position at a boutique advisory house that specialized in exactly the kind of forensic financial work she'd been doing for the past 2 months. The compensation figures attached to each were the kind that would have felt like a different language 3 months ago, when she was calculating whether her double shifts covered the month's utilities. Zuri read each offer carefully. She thought about each one honestly, and then she set them aside. The conversation with Ethan happened naturally, the way most of their important conversations had. Not in a formal meeting, not with an agenda, but sitting across from each other with coffee going cold between them while the actual subject worked its way to the surface. "You're not going to take any of them," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No. What do you want to do?" She had been thinking about this since before Greg was arrested. Since before the press conference. Since the night she'd read her father's notebook entry in her mother's kitchen and understood that her father's work and her own had been moving toward the same point from opposite ends of a decade. "The problem with how this happened," she said, "isn't that Greg was dishonest. Dishonest people exist in every industry. The problem is that the structures meant to catch what he was doing weren't designed to see what he was doing. The compliance frameworks, the internal audit processes, the board oversight, all of it was built to catch obvious fraud. Not patient, systemic manipulation." She looked at him. Someone needs to build the frameworks that catch the other kind. Ethan was quiet. "Inside Caldwell Capital," she said. "A financial ethics division. Not reactive. Not responding to fraud after it happens. Proactive. Designed to identify the early structural signatures of the kind of operation we just dismantled before the damage is done. You'd lead it. As a partner," she said. "Not an employee. Equal standing." He didn't hesitate. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "You understand this isn't charity. I'm not doing you a favor." "I know," he said. "You'd be doing me the second one actually, and I know better than to take either of them for granted." The paperwork took 3 weeks. Warren Albright handled the structural details, the partnership terms, the division charter, the reporting lines that would give Zuri genuine independence rather than the kind of institutional independence that meant nothing in practice. It was built carefully, the way everything worth building is built. The morning Zuri went to her father's grave, the city was doing what early spring does in New York, pretending to be warmer than it was, the sunlight real, but the air still carrying the memory of winter beneath it. Her mother came with her. They stood together in front of the stone with the ordinary sounds of the cemetery around them. Distant traffic, birds, the quiet that cities allow in their in-between spaces. Zuri had thought about what she wanted to say. She'd rehearsed it mentally several times, in the way you do when the words feel important enough to deserve preparation. But standing there, she found the rehearsed version felt too formal for the conversation she actually wanted to have. She said, simply, You were right. About all of it. And I finished what you started. Her mother's hand found hers. They stood there for a while without speaking, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that holds things rather than emptying them. Lucas's book came out 4 months later. It was thorough, careful, and unsparing in a way that the best investigative journalism is. It didn't editorialize where the facts spoke for themselves, and it let the facts speak at length. The Meridian Circle's operational history, the 3 prior corporate collapses, the names from the master file, and the institutional positions they had used as cover. Robert Bennett's original investigation and the decade-long gap between his findings and their public vindication. The book spent 11 weeks on the bestseller list. Greg cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentencing, and his cooperation was detailed enough to confirm the full network map her father had drawn on graph paper in a storage unit in Queens. The convictions that followed were not swift. These things never are, but they were coming, moving through the legal system with the slow, inevitable weight of well-documented evidence. Caldwell Capital's stock recovered in the measured, confidence-by-confidence way that genuine institutional recovery works. Cautious at first, then steadier as the counterfiling resolved, and the board issued its formal statements of restored confidence, and the new Financial Ethics Division published its first set of structural transparency protocols, documents that several other firms quietly requested copies of within the first month. Ethan returned to the restaurant one afternoon in late spring. Same corner booth, same tablecloth, probably a different one, but the same shade of white. He hadn't called ahead, hadn't made a point of it. He'd simply had a meeting nearby and found himself standing outside and decided. He sat down. He ordered sparkling water. He looked at the table where everything had started, where he had made a joke at a woman's expense and had the singular experience of having the joke become the most consequential moment of his professional life. Zuri appeared at the table. She was still working some shifts. Not for necessity, she had been clear about that when people asked, and people did ask. She worked the shifts because there was something grounding about it, something that kept the distance between her new life and her real one from growing too wide. Her father had believed that people who understood where money moved should never stop understanding the places where ordinary life happened. She was trying to honor that. She stood at the table with a small smile that had something private in it. "What would you do?" Ethan asked. "If you were me?" She looked at him for a moment, at the man who had called her a punchline and had then, when it mattered, stood at a podium in front of cameras and said her name. "I already did," she said. She left to check on the next table. Ethan sat with his water and looked out at the restaurant, at the ordinary, unceasing motion of people going about their days, carrying things, exchanging things, living the complicated, ordinary lives that happened beneath and around, and completely indifferent to the financial systems that shaped them. He thought about a man named Robert Bennett who had understood that following the money meant following the power, and who had been right about that, and who had paid for being right in the cruelest possible way. He thought about the daughter that man had raised. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do. A long time later, the headlines told a version of the story that the public could follow. Financial reforms inspired by the scandal, new regulatory frameworks, a woman named Zuri Bennett leading an ethics initiative that was changing how the industry thought about internal accountability. But the truest version of the story was simpler than any headline. Sometimes the smartest person in the room is the one nobody thought to listen to. And sometimes, if the right people finally decide to listen, it's not too late for the truth to matter. If the people in power had listened to the ones they overlooked just a little sooner, how many lives would never have been destroyed in the first place? If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and stay close, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you.